44 attendees, it says so far, and it seems to be most people have joined. So as you just saw the little announcement, we will be recording this, and it will then be put up on the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council website for people to see or push out later. So to start off with, my name is Rachel Rubin, and I am on the steering committee of the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. And we welcome you to our quarterly webinar. This time, obviously, we're going to be talking about the health consequences of the war on Gaza. And this particular series has been co-sponsored with the Gaza Mental Health Foundation with the excellent support from Grassroots International that is allowing us to use their Zoom platform today and tech support. So thank you all. The format's a little bit of just sort of ground rules. It is being recorded. People can put their questions into the Q&A, not the chat. And then I will be speaking out the questions at the end. So the format will be about 40 minutes. We are having two presentations, and I'll introduce each of the speakers in just a second. And then we will entertain Q&A for about 20 minutes or so from the audience using the Q&A function. Please stay muted at all times. And you can write the questions during the presentation and during the Q&A. So what you need to do is you can hover down. Usually it's at the lower end of your screen. If you're on an iPad, it may be on the top. And you hover over and you'll see Q&A, and that's where you put in. You can click on that, and then you can type in your questions. All right, so now we have two speakers. First will be Alice Rothchild, who is also on the steering committee of the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. She's a retired OB-GYN, an author, a filmmaker, and a member of the steering committee. She has been to Gaza 4 times and was most recently there in August, not anticipating what would be happening in October, obviously. And she was focusing on human rights organizations with Grassroots International. In addition, she is the mentor liaison for We Are Not Numbers, which is a program in Gaza that matches young writers with English-speaking mentors to build their skills to create powerful personal stories about their own lives. And she is also on the board of the Gaza Mental Health Foundation. And secondly will be Othman Mohammed, who is a child psychiatrist, born and raised as a refugee in Lebanon, educated at the American University of Beirut, the University of Balamand, UC San Diego, and the Harvard Medical School. And he is currently an assistant professor of psychiatry with the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School, Bay State. He is also on the board of Gaza Mental Health Foundation. I'm going to turn this over to Alice, and she will present first, and then we will be followed by Othman. All right, so thanks so much, and here we go.
Let me just get this organized here. Okay. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to be giving you an overview of the health consequences of the war on Gaza. I believe today is day 43. And I'm going to start out with a quote from Avi Dichter, who's the Israeli Minister for Agriculture and former head of the Shin Bet. And he said, "We are now actually rolling out the Gaza Nakba. And we are at a point where 1 in 57 Gazans have either been killed or injured." Now, just very briefly, I've been to Gaza 4 times. As was mentioned, the last time was in August with Grassroots International. And each time I've been invited by the Gaza Community Health Program. And I've been involved in direct services, doing women's empowerment, and a lot of documentation. And I'm also, as mentioned, involved with a number of organizations that are focused on Gaza. I'm just going to sum up this slide because it is the take-home message. More than 75 years of Israeli domination and dispossession has affected Palestinian life through occupation, siege, annexation, de-development, and permanent displacement of refugees, severely impacting the ability of Palestinians to access the essential building blocks of health. The fragmentation of society and destruction of the ability and opportunity to create essential institutions involved in healthcare has created a reality that is recognized today as medical apartheid. Two separate systems, two separate realities. And you see this with the impact of this with the disparities in life expectancy, almost 74 years for Palestinians in the territories, 82 and a half for Israelis, and in infant mortality, around 18 per 1,000 live births in the territories and 2.9 in Israel. And this is accomplished through active de-development of the healthcare system, through a strict medical permitting system, through chronic lack of medications and equipment that is all controlled by Israeli authorities, by direct attacks on medical institutions, and by the high level of conflict-related trauma. When we think about the things that I'm going to be talking about, I want it all to be framed within international law and human rights law. And the most important one, I think, is the Geneva Convention, which basically states that an occupying power, which is Israel, is not allowed to interfere with the performance of healthcare personnel doing their humanitarian functions. Now, if we look at healthcare in Gaza, it has been described as fragmented and incoherent by Lancet. We have a population of more than 2.3 million people. The Ministry of Health was established in 1994 after Oslo. We also have the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which was established around 1950 for the care of the refugees, and there are approximately 1.5 million Gazan refugees in 8 refugee camps. There's also been a proliferation of non-governmental organizations like Palestinian Medical Relief Society. There are a host of private providers, and then there is the role of the Israeli government in active de-development. Now, if we look at the institutions that were present before the assault, there are 13 governmental hospitals, 142 primary health centers, primarily Ministry of Health, but also UNRWA and non-governmental organizations. There are approximately 40 private hospitals, 2 medical schools, and a number of professional schools. But there's a tremendous mismatch between the available personnel and the available jobs. So for instance, before the aggression, there were 120 nursing positions open every year and 5,000 nursing students in Gaza. There are less than 20 psychiatrists in Gaza and less than 7 are doctors. Now, we're all talking before, several years ago, the UN said that Gaza would not be habitable by 2020, and we are already in 2023. So what we started with was a desperate humanitarian catastrophe with the ongoing siege. Water is highly polluted and salinated, and things like healthcare, nutrition, fuel, electricity, sewerage, housing, this was all on life supports before the assault. There's tremendous amount of environmental contamination from all of the bombings. There's the climate crisis. Gaza is a coastal plain. There was the impact of the COVID epidemic, which decimated a lot of the healthcare. And we should also remember that the Great March of Return, which was an annual march protesting conditions and demand and proclaiming different demands, was resulted in a huge amount of death and injury and an amazing amount of orthopedic injuries and a crisis in orthopedics. Other big health issues besides the ones that I have mentioned, are the lack of specialists, the fact that medical personnel are exhausted and overworked and often unpaid. When we look at UNRWA, which is critical for the refugees, their funding was slashed by Trump. It was partially restored by Biden. And pre-war, they were saying that they were going to have to stop operations because of a budget crisis and donor fatigue, and that was before everything happened. The Israeli siege not only controls everything that goes in and out, but the Israeli military found all sorts of other ways to torture Gazans. They had a practice of fumigating farmland with herbicides along the eastern perimeter fence, decimating crops. They destroyed the fishing industry. This was a fishing culture by severely limiting the fishing zone and repeatedly attacking fisherfolk and their boats. And they also have this thing where right before harvesting, they would intentionally flood the crops along the eastern perimeter fence, which is the most fertile area. So when I was there in August, there were about 18,000 Palestinians from Gaza working in Israel. Most of them were economic workers who had no coverage for injury and death. So they were working in agriculture and construction, high-risk occupations. And when they got injured or sick, they were basically dumped back into Gaza, where they could not receive the medical care that they needed. I saw child beggars on the street, reports of men selling their kidneys to feed their families, and families no longer able to afford olive oil. In August, the UN Right to Health program revealed that the number of exit permits for people from Gaza was 88% below the monthly average in 2000. Most of them were work-related. Only 6% of the exits were for patients, for medical treatment, high-level medical treatment. And of those, 19% were not approved on time, which means you take the sickest people, make them apply, make them wait, and then make them miss their appointments. Now, I'm going to give you the sort of current status. I kept updating the numbers, and it's just this dizzying display of horror. People are talking about the total disintegration of the healthcare system. There are over 12,000 people that have been killed. Over two-thirds are women and children. There are more than 32,000 people injured. There were almost 4,000 people missing under the rubble, with 1,700 plus are children. And a lot of medical personnel are talking about the smell of death in the streets and the hospital with rotting corpses that have not been buried. There's also an explosion going on in the West Bank, which we should not forget, with over 200 killed. Probably about 50 children, 2,600 injured, also children included. And then in Israel, there were about 1,200 killed with the Hamas attack, almost 5,000 injured, and there are currently about 53 soldiers that have been killed in Gaza. There were 240 hostages in Gaza, 4 have been released. And what we have seen since the beginning of this onslaught is relentless Israeli airstrikes on civilian structures, on hospitals, on clinics, on ambulances. They say it's approximately 2 atomic bombs worth of bombing. There's a full electricity blackout, a lack of fuel, water, and food. And the thing to understand about the lack of fuel is that when Israel cuts off the electricity, the fuel is used to generate electricity. So if there's no fuel, then there's no electricity generators. Almost half of housing units have been destroyed. There are approximately 1.6 million internally displaced people, many of them sheltering in UNRWA-designated shelters. There are severe shortages of water, food, and medicine, and people are now talking about the risk of actual starvation and death from starvation. This has produced, obviously, increasing tensions intracommunally and increasing gender-based violence. There are some 5,500 deliveries each month. These women have no prenatal care and are not sure where they're going to deliver and under what kind of conditions. Many thousands and thousands of people have moved from north to south. At the beginning, the Israelis allowed vehicles, but lately you have to walk, and people have been described being shot at, their legs shot at, being arrested, beaten, stripped. Once again, reminding us that there are no safe places in Gaza. In the NICUs and the ICUs and in the dialysis units, any patient who's relied on electricity to live are at risk for dying, and they are now dying. This is also true of cancer patients. And as I mentioned, there have been many attacks on healthcare and health facilities and personnel. Approximately 200 personnel have been killed, health facilities damaged. 2/3 of the hospitals and many centers are unable to function. The last time I saw data on this, there's 1 hospital barely functioning in the north, and there are just absolutely critical shortages of drugs, blood products, and supplies. There have been no medical permits to the West Bank and Israel for high-level care, and providers are also reporting unusual burns on the dead and the wounded, raising the specter of the use of white phosphorus, which is illegal in bombing. The Rafah crossing, which is the crossing to Egypt, has had a little over 1,000 trucks carrying food, water, and medical supplies, and a teeny bit of fuel for WHO, ambulances and hospital, and for UNRWA. This is a teeny tiny fraction of what is needed. When you look at the stocks of essential food, commodities, it's down to 0. And as I mentioned, there's no fishing allowed. The hospitals in the north have been under extreme attack, and they have also been over capacity in sheltering thousands of internally displaced people. There have been some evacuations as directed by Israel. The groundwater production is less than 5% of pre-hostilities. The sewage pumping stations and treatment facilities have been bombed, so there is now sewage flooding into the Mediterranean Sea and in the streets. The wastewater treatment plants are shut down. And as you can imagine, infectious diseases like chickenpox, scabies, respiratory illnesses, and diarrhea are significantly increasing. In addition, over half the educational facilities have been destroyed, and many of them are UNRWA facilities that are used to shelter internally displaced people. UNRWA reports over 100 staff have been killed, and every day I get, we're ceasing operations tomorrow kind of messages, so it's going to happen any minute now. There have been hundreds of identified bodies and also rotting corpses at Shifa, where there's been no capacity to put people into morgues, and there have been mass graves in Rafah and in Gaza City, particularly at Shifa Hospital. Palestinian armed groups continue their indiscriminate rocket fire into Israel. Israeli bombardment continues unrelentingly. So we see tremendous amounts of civilian injury and death, what is now described as a genocide of Gazans and war crimes by Hamas and mostly by Israel. I want to focus on Al-Shifa Hospital. That was the main hospital located in Gaza City. It was a 700-bed hospital and served about 500,000 people. It's on a huge complex and employed 1,500 medical staff, including 500 doctors and 760 nurses. And here, this picture, you can see all the people sheltering around the hospital, hoping that it was a safe place. So before November 15th, there had been bombardments around the hospital and several that hit the surgeries departments, coronary care division, a warehouse. The maternity center was hit twice, and an outpatient clinic. On the 15th, Israeli troops and tanks entered the hospital. They took control of several sections, started searching and interrogating people. Nephrology and internal medical departments were the first to be stormed, and they also detonated a medicine storehouse. The reports that I have seen are that Israeli troops ordered all young men on the hospital grounds to surrender. They took dozens captive, including displaced people, relatives of patients, and injured people in the hospital. Many Palestinian men were interrogated, some while being held naked and blindfolded, and some taken to unknown locations. Israel has accused Hamas of placing a, quote, command center below Shifa, but Hamas and hospital officials have denied this claim. The New York Times has reported that Israeli soldiers found approximately a dozen guns, a grenade, protective vests, and a military uniform within an MRI unit. It's unable, the New York Times was unable to know whether that was actually found, whether the army placed it there. They have not found any evidence of a major command center. When the assault happened, there were no reports of clashes with Hamas gunmen, and the New York Times reported it was more like a violent police raid than a pitched battle. 20 out of the 23 ICU patients have died. 17 other patients have died because of lack of supplies, oxygen, and water. And of course, the premature babies in the NICU are at extreme risk. This is a picture you perhaps have seen where the incubators are no longer functional, so they put the babies all together, hoping that they would stay warm with each other's body warmth. There were about 7,000 people sheltering in the hospital, and a doctor reported that around 9 a.m. on the 17th, the hospital was told to evacuate in 1 hour. The Israelis deny they said this, but many people have said they said this. They reported that it was impossible to evacuate. There were no ambulances, no fuel for transportation, and the situation reported a great state of panic and fear. It was also reported that they were told to do this at gunpoint, and many people just started walking out. Injured people were pushed in wheelchairs on hospital gurneys, and a small amount were left behind with the medical staff. And one reporter said the situation is really dire and the facility is now largely deserted. And the Israeli forces are continuing to ransack different parts of this buildings and blow up walls and look for what they think is there that they haven't found yet. I would like to just conclude that a Hamas war crime does not justify an Israeli genocide, that I think what we are seeing here is a tremendous amount of racism and revenge, in numerous violations of international law, collective punishment, the creation of multi-generational trauma, clear-cut ethnic cleansing and genocide. And it is also quite clear that the health of Palestinians is intrinsically linked to their liberation and to the end of the siege. And what we need right now is a massive ceasefire, massive humanitarian aid, a release of the hostages, and then it is critical to address the root causes, because that's the only way this will stop, and also to hold Israel and the US, its primary supporter, accountable. Thank you. So I have to stop share. I don't see the function to stop. Oh, here it is. Thank you.
Great. So next, Othman, and I think you should be able to share your screen.
Can you see my full screen now?
Not quite yet. Try doing the slideshow view again, and then do the display setting trick.
Okay, and then go to where it says slideshow at the top. Oh, you're in presenter mode. That's why we're
Okay.
seeing both.
And then go up to display settings, and then
What happened? Sorry.
Yeah, just click there.
then to display settings, and then switch presenter and slideshow view.
Yeah, I don't see it for some reason. Maybe more.
Oh,
It's at the
no,
top.
all the way at the top, upper left, next to it.
Here.
Yep.
This
Swap
way.
presenter. Yes, that one.
Thank you for your patience. Appreciate that.
No, it's all right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alice, for the presentation. Full disclosure, I do have family in Gaza, so we're in touch on a daily basis. They're alive, but they're not okay. They're displaced. I think one of the best ways to address the question of the mental health outcomes of the war in Gaza is to go over some of the things that we know were happening before October 7th. You know, this would help us understand things a little more on the ground. So before this war, and because of the other wars that are in Gaza, we know that there's a deep and big shortage of mental health needs in Gaza. There is little medications that we can offer to people who struggle with mental health conditions, and this is you know, so difficult because we rely on often medications to help people who struggle with depression and PTSD, and there is a lack of about 39 medications that we usually use in the field. There is little also government support for different mental health clinicians, and that's why you see a lot of NGOs take over and pitch in, try to help. Like in 2014, the WHO, after the onslaught in Gaza in 2014, there was an increase in 20% of the population that had developed mental health conditions. According to UNICEF, more than 300,000 children, which 10 every 30 in Gaza, required some sort of psychosocial care. You know, I'm a child psychiatrist, so when I look at these numbers, I think about a classroom. Typically in a classroom, if you have 30 children in the classroom, that's kind of the average size, maybe a little more in Gaza. But 10 of each those classrooms, 10 of 30, 10 students in 30 are not going to be able to function as students because they have PTSD, because they have depression, or because they have permanent bodily injuries. One of the clinics in Gaza, the GCMHP, had a total panel of 50,000 patients, and they get about 1,000 cases annually, and 70% of them are children. So children are at the forefront, as we can see during this war as well, in terms of casualties of war, and also disability. I saw a video of a 1-year-old who's already an amputee because of this war in Gaza. And the UNRWA, which offers psychosocial services, usually they offer that within the scope of their schools. So they're school-based services. And now that the schools in UNRWA are actually not functioning anymore, there is no school now, we're not seeing those services, let alone that the UNRWA staff have been targeted, and about 100 plus or minus UNRWA staff have been killed since the beginning of this genocide. Maintaining clinical skills is also an issue in Gaza. Training staff, people who have enough expertise to treat these conditions, also is another big struggle. But there is little help people that can offer because of the geographical barriers that Israel's placed on traveling to Gaza, and also because of language barrier. It seems to be a big problem to actually be able to help people who help others. In a big meta-analysis of what happens during in the world arena in terms of wars, what is the prevalence of PTSD? Not just in Gaza, but like worldwide. The estimates are about 15 to 17%. However, the numbers are a lot bigger in the Gaza Strip. In one study, about 40% of children from the Gaza Strip reported having PTSD. And this is not too far from the West Bank children. About 34% have PTSD. And just to put numbers in perspective, the worldwide prevalence of PTSD is roughly around 3 to 4%. In Israel, the prevalence of PTSD is roughly between, depending on the study that you read, between 3 to 10%. And one might safely assume that these numbers are probably way worse in this war than the previous wars that we've witnessed. In 2014, in the immediate aftermath of the war, about 35% of the adult clients had major depressive disorders, 25% had PTSD, 45% of kids were coming for PTSD symptoms, and that's just in one clinic, the GCMHP. And then 10% suffered from bedwetting episodes. And this is secondary bedwetting, which means that they didn't have that issue before, but they had it because of the war. And the last study I want to quote here, which is also another landmark, in 2019, this is a more recent study, about 88% of the Gazan children witnessed a home being destroyed. 88%, that's 90% of kids seeing a home being destroyed. And 70% report that they witnessed war violence against at least one of their family members. So if you're a child in Gaza, 90% of these kids have seen a home destroyed, and 70% of them, actually, 70% would have seen violence against an intimate family member. 44% of children had at least one death in their family due to the Israeli invasion, and 33% met actually the criteria for having PTSD and depression. When I say PTSD, I just want to clarify something from a mental health standpoint, because this term tends to be thrown around quite a bit. PTSD, the usual thought about it is that this is an incident that happened because of a trauma. You can have some flashbacks, you can have some fear, you can have nightmares. Yeah, but this is not what we're seeing here. What you see in Gaza and in war zones, but particularly in Gaza, because of the perpetual wars on Gaza and the ongoing genocide, as historian Len Pappy likes to call it, incremental genocide happening in Gaza. And what you're seeing is a different kind of trauma. This is called complex PTSD. And this complex PTSD is way beyond just having nightmares and way beyond having some flashbacks. Those kind of traumas affect what we call the ABCD of the human psyche. A is the affects, the emotional aspects, which creates a pervasive sense of loss, true joy of life, negativity, and pessimism. And B, behaviors. It lowers their capacity to be able to address stress in your life and regulate your intense emotions. Hence, gender-based violence, like Dr. Rothchild just mentioned. Behaviors can become a real problem to control. Cognitions, you develop a pervasive sense of lack of security, hopelessness, and uncertainty about the future. And then dynamics in relationship, where there's a decline in richness and quality of intimacy in the relationship. So all these things, you have to imagine a person in Gaza having to deal with all these battling emotions and feelings and cognitions. And then that makes us understand then that complex PTSD and trauma in Gaza is not just a disorder of fear. You're not just afraid. It is a disorder of absence. You're really absent from life if you've experienced such traumas that are catastrophic in nature. And that helps us explain and understand the reasons for the high unemployment rates in Gaza. When you talk about employment, it's not just because there are no jobs, because it is very difficult to find the drive to function and live a functional life if you have to deal with all these difficult emotions. Before the recent war in Gaza, the active players to help with mental health needs was UNRWA, GCMHP, Wafaq, Aisha. These are women's group. Zahra is also a women's group as well. There's the Palestine Trauma Center and the Red Crescent. But since the recent war in Gaza, we don't have any real services on the ground. So, for example, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program on October 28th posted on their Facebook page, and we've been in touch with the leaders there, that we've lost touch with all the staff in our clinic. So there is no functioning entity called the GCMHP anymore. They lost touch with all the staff. So there's a solution of the mental health system in Gaza. UNRWA, like we said, they're devastated for the loss of their colleagues who themselves have been traumatized and unable to function, let alone provide services to others who might be struggling. And then if we wanted to move forward, if we were to say, what if we offer services? What if we offer support to people in Gaza? How can we do that? I get a lot of calls and emails and text messages. People want to help. And in 2014, I, with the help of many caring colleagues and friends, we launched a platform on social media, on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, to address the trauma in Gaza, the post-war trauma. That was when the war had ended in 2014. Basically, modules about maybe 10 to 12 hours of addressing trauma, psychoeducation. And I've been trying during this war to reactivate this channel. Nothing that I know in psychiatry will work. Nothing, unfortunately. Nothing that we know that helps people who are suffering from mental health from wars actually will work. Why? Because this is what works. What works in helping people in disaster zones is to establish a sense of safety, geographical safety, to say things like to a kid, to a child, we're not out of that area, we are safe. We're now back home. There is no home. People are homeless now. My family is homeless in Gaza. Their house was destroyed. A temporal sense of safety. You can say, oh, that happened in the last war, but this is not happening now. It is happening every day. Physical safety. They can't harm your body anymore. People are having panic attacks day in, day out. They're scared to sleep every single day. They're waking tired. They're not resting. Their bodies are not resting. Psychological. You can say they can't scare no more. This is not true. Also, to address trauma, you have to be able to process what happened and make meaning out of it. To be able to do that, you have to have adequate nutrition and hydration to bring your body close to where it was before this war. And this is also not something that is possible. Perhaps what people in Gaza might be left with is their sense of faith and belief that maybe, in the hereafter there will be some justice that can help get some sense of relief, perhaps for some time. Also being able to resolve traumatic memories, to be able to grieve effectively. And to be able to grieve effectively, you really have to deal with your trauma and talk about it. You know, as we grieve our losses, you are hoping to find a way where you can reconcile your sadness with the memories of loved ones. That's what we do when we grieve our losses. It is very difficult and emotionally exhausting to try to grieve someone that you lost, but who's died from a traumatic loss. So you try to remember them, and only you can remember the dismembered bodies and the blood floating everywhere. It's a very difficult grief process. And then you would need a sense of connectedness to others around you to be able to get out of this trauma. However, this is a liability and a vulnerability to actually gather people together, like kids to play, for example. The recent attack on Fakhura, a Norwest school, where 200 people died from an airstrike. I want to say died while they're in their rooms in their school. And had there been a gathering of children playing, you'd have had a way worse casualty number than what we've witnessed. So there is not much that we can do right now from a mental health standpoint to help people in Gaza. And really the only thing we can do is really call for a meaningful ceasefire so we can stop the political determinants of health. This is a famous paper, and this really highlights how political and warfare trauma affects the bodies of people in the war zone, including the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank right now. So the suffering here, to alleviate it, the only thing we can do is think about a political pressure. We have to keep the pressure going. We have to show up. We have to make our voices heard, because this is what will end the suffering of people in Gaza. And with that, I yield my time.
Thank you so very much. This has been tremendous. So thanks to both Dr. Rothchild and Dr. Mohammed. And there are more comments than questions, but I'm going to read them out. First of all, is that there were a couple of folks wanting to know whether the slides could be available like on our website for people to use. And I said that we could, with appropriate permission of the authors, we could do that. I see some nods. And then the first question, it's more of a comment from Ellen Isaacs saying an Intercept article claimed Israel built tunnels and underground facilities beneath hospitals in the 1980s. It also doesn't make much sense to say weapons are stored near an MRI, which would make the MRI unusable. So comments about that.
Well, I think that, what we're seeing is this Israeli propaganda machine saying there's this massive facility underneath the hospital. And as the New York Times has said so far, the evidence is quite underwhelming. And it's also not clear, if you find a couple of guns and some safety vests or whatever they found, who put that there? Would Hamas leave a couple of guns for the Israelis to find? So there's a lot of, there's no outside documentation of what the Israelis are saying. And also, even if there were issues in the basement of the hospital or under the hospital, according to international law, you're still not allowed to bomb hospitals. That's like not allowed. And, they say, well, if there has to be a justification that the danger was great enough, the standards for that are very, very stringent. And I think that most of us in the international community feel that those standards have not been met. And also, if you look at the pattern of Israeli bombing, they are going after healthcare facilities, bombing ambulances, bombing healthcare centers. This is not within the bounds of international law. The other thing, Othman, I wanted to make a point of is, people talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but it can't ever be post if the trauma doesn't end. And so one of the things that I learned a lot from the Gaza Community Health Program was this idea that nothing in Gaza is post, because, you know, this is number 6 assault since Hamas took over. And so, you know, young people have been through enormous numbers of wars and trauma. So you never get a period of time to recover before the next assault starts. And we have, I don't think that's, that phenomenon has been studied in psychiatry, unless you know of some study about that, because things have to get better for people to get better.
Yeah, thanks. Othman, I don't know if you had anything else to add, but the next question I think you could both certainly respond on. So Simon Pillar asks, we know some of the answers to this already. What are the chances that a significant number of Israeli healthcare workers will come to grips with what their government is doing and oppose it in any significant way?
Do you want to try that, Othman?
Yeah, I think we're seeing some activism in Israel from healthcare workers, but we're also seeing other voices as well. We're seeing people saying there is a letter that was signed by Israeli physicians, basically cheering on the IDF and saying, "Finish your work." But luckily, there are different physician groups in Israel who've been calling for some sense, really, and asking to look at the humanitarian condition in Gaza. Here in the U.S., we're witnessing also a struggle. Different medical organizations have not really talked about a ceasefire, have not really talked about what's happening to the peoples in Gaza and their bodies, their health. I'm going to talk about my organization, the American Psychiatric Association. Only last week issued a statement to talk about what's happening in Gaza. The day after October 7th, or a couple of days after that, they issued a statement denouncing the atrocities that happened that day. And they did not change that statement until only last week, and not from an awakening of consciousness. They did that because of intense lobbying, and because in different caucuses in the APA, we've been pushing for a statement to say the people in Gaza matter. And until this day, until this morning, in different caucuses in the APA, we have American psychiatrists who are saying ceasefire is not an option. Let Israel finish its work. We have really a crisis of humanity here. And I believe that in order to dehumanize the Palestinians and allow that to happen to their bodies, people had to lose part of their humanity. And this is the only explanation I have to understand my colleagues who are numb to the Palestinian pain and to what's happening to the people in Gaza.
Rachel, would you feel comfortable talking about what happened at the American Public Health Association?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, there's even a question in the Q&A that talks a little bit about that and puts an ask in for us. So just this past week, the American Public Health Association conference met in Atlanta, the annual yearly conference that brings together anywhere between 10 and 15,000 public health professionals from across the United States, and as well as with international guests. And a few of us put together a late breaker policy. They have what's called a governing council, which works sort of like a Congress, and we vote and debate on a variety of things and they're representatives from the different sections and caucuses and affiliates that are part of the organization. And so we put together what's called a late breaker policy, because policies usually have to be in February for a November meeting. But you can put something in within the last month if it's of timely interest or importance, as this was. So we put together a late breaker policy that was 11 pages long that talked about a ceasefire as its main ask, but documented the history of the oppression of occupation and then blockade, especially in Gaza, and also talked about this policy was written, 3 weeks ago. So the numbers that we knew at that point in terms of healthcare facilities being attacked, et cetera. And the action steps in this policy were basically asking the American Public Health Association, which is a lobbying organization, an advocacy organization, to work with the president and Congress to work for a ceasefire, release of hostages, as well as Palestinian detainees in Israel, and to bring in humanitarian aid that includes fuel and water and food, etc., and to stop targeting and to basically abide by Geneva Convention laws. And so there was about a 2 hour, hour and a half debate back and forth, and debates usually last 10 to 20 minutes. And so this went on for an hour and a half. We then took a break, and then the authors, we got together and we came up with a 1-paragraph statement that then didn't have any of the background in it whatsoever. It just called for a ceasefire, release of hostages and detainees, and the importance of bringing in humanitarian aid immediately. And that passed with a 90% positive vote. But it was quite contentious. And maybe I'll even just, even though I realize I'm skipping over Hubert Murray's question, we will get back to that. But let me just read Townsend Cook because it relates to this. And he said, speaking of political action, what are JVP, HAC, and allied Palestinian medical groups doing to lobby Congress and others? It seems like the dam is about to break in terms of Congress supporting a ceasefire, and the public health reasoning for this is particularly compelling. Is there anything medical public health professionals can do, like meeting with congressional staff to build support for a ceasefire? Can we use the APHA resolution as a jumping off point for this type of advocacy? So yeah, right?
And I should just say that the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council, since the onset of hostilities, has been issuing a medical update every 3 to 4 days. It's on the jvphealth.org website. And we are encouraging people to use that up-to-date data to lobby Congress, to yell at Biden, to go to your representatives, to write letters to the editor. But we think it's valuable for people to speak as healthcare providers and also to have up-to-date information. So we try to summarize everything, and it's basically been coming out every Monday and Thursday. There's also been health workers, I'm blocking on the exact name, that have been doing protests. Is it Health for Palestine? I just don't remember the exact name. So there've been more protesting kind of events as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in working with myself, working with folks and their incredible energy around this, at least since the policy in particular came out, is really trying to leverage that, being, sort of the largest public health organization in the country, and to work with other, organizations, whether it's the Health Advisory Council or other, collections. The American College of Pediatrics, I think, did come out with a short statement, so I heard. And so to maybe also work with our professional organizations to push out statements that then can also be used to pressure lawmakers. So let me go back to Hubert Murray's question. He said, Alice, can you comment on the health impacts of people in Gaza being forced to drink seawater?
So what's happening is that the desalination plants are not functioning, the water treatment plants are not functioning, and so the water that is basically available is salt water. And first of all, people are bathing in the Mediterranean, and they're also washing their clothes in the Mediterranean, and there is raw sewage in the Mediterranean. So you can imagine that's not particularly healthy. And if you drink it, besides the risk of infectious disease, salt water is not a healthy thing to be drinking in terms of kidney disease, hypertension, a host of medical issues, and people can go into renal failure. I mean, there's all sorts of medical things that can happen from drinking salt water, but people are desperate. And also it doesn't quench your thirst because it's salt water. So it's a measure of the impact of this decimation of infrastructure, collective punishment against civilians, and part of what leads people like us to call this a genocide, because making it people unable to have fresh water to drink is just a horrifying thing to do. But you should also remember that there wasn't a whole lot of fresh water before. So you took a situation where things were already quite borderline. I mean, when I was there, when I didn't drink any water that came out of the faucet, but when I took a shower, it was salt water that came out of the shower, which kind of was interesting. So I think that we need to remember that it was already a very beleaguered system, and now it's just incredibly dangerous for people.
Right. All right. Next question from Don Wagner and Linda Khatib. Could you as physicians comment more on how the brain is damaged by severe or complex trauma, and if left untreated, what happens to these children?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question, and this is why when we say complex trauma, I think, like Alice said, this has not been studied enough to be able to understand what happens to these, especially the children, right? But typically, in our brains, we have centers that have to do with the alarm system, the centers for fight or flight responses that control how you react to fear and anxiety and stress in the environment. And we know for a fact that trauma that is perpetual and intense and severe disrupts that HP axis, the axis that deals with stress in the environment. And not only does that affect your mental health and your capacity to be able to enjoy life and to be able to be present in life, but it also affects your bodily functions. We know from the ACE study, that looked at adults who have diseases like cardiac health disease or cancers. And when we looked at their early childhood, we found that the level of adversity they faced was higher than the average population. If you've been exposed to complex trauma, you are at a higher risk to develop bodily illnesses, cardiovascular diseases, cancers, but also the psychological ramifications of not being able to enjoy life and to be present. From a mental health standpoint, typically depression as a disease of the brain and the psyche can respond okay to treatment like psychopharmacology, medications, and psychotherapy. However, depression that is based in complex trauma is extremely difficult to treat. And some would say it's resistant to treatment. You can try all the medications. I've worked in community mental health for years and years. And the most challenging cases to work with and heal from their wounds are people who are depressed because of their traumas. It is very difficult, which then affects their function in life, and they're able to be employed, and they're able to enjoy being with the family, or just the regular day-to-day actions that we take that bring us joy and happiness.
And I would also like to say, not on the brain level, because I'm a gynecologist, but I've met with numbers of women's groups and also with Palestinian Center for Human Rights, who works with women. And what a number of these groups described was families where the fathers who were once functional have had years of difficulties finding employment because there's like a 50% unemployment rate that's led to a whole host of mental health issues, sometimes tramadol addiction, a sense of despondency and inability to take care of their family. Many of these men are then arrested, spend some horrifically traumatic time in an Israeli prison, and then they come back to their families and they're ill-equipped to be present for their families. And so that's where you see more gender-based violence, where these men whose lives have basically been ruined by siege and oppression and inability to have success for themselves, taking it out on the women in their lives, and then that destroys the family, and then there's a divorce. And so you can see that this is not just an individual problem, but it's a family problem as well. And then the women are most responsible for the health of the children. So the women are trying to take care of all of these children who are highly traumatized, their husbands who are suffering from all the ill effects that I've just mentioned. And it is a really, really major, major problem that we see a lot, and that I heard very poignantly from women just talking about their lives and their issues.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but there are a couple of questions that I'll just sort of combine that we're talking about what's sort of the applicability and importance of the trauma-informed care kinds of initiatives that many of us in public health as well as medical care have been trained on or supposed to embrace. How does that even apply within this context?
Yeah, great question also. So I think trauma-informed care, the way we understand it, is you have to be culturally sensitive. You have to understand what people's traumas and how they affect their lives. And I believe the same thing applies in the case of Gaza, whereby trauma-informed care has to be informed about the true etiology and reason for the suffering of people in Gaza and the suffering people in the occupied territories. And so this suffering is because of occupation, the dehumanization, and the blockade. So to adopt a trauma-informed care model, that would have to take a different route other than just talk therapy and medication. That has to take on the task of advocacy. Advocacy is a language of healing. Advocacy is a language of healing the trauma that is based in political violence.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's, yeah. People wanted the link I just put in the chat, the text of the late breaker policy that passed from APHA. It's one paragraph. We have a longer press release, which has been going out in various on Twitter and other places. We can also post that on our website, the APHA statement with the full press release from the working group, what we call our Palestine Health Justice working group for APHA. Oh, and one final question, and then maybe we should break. And this again is just a horrible, traumatic thing that's going on. I've heard that operations like cesarean sections have been carried out without anesthesia. Have you any info about the outcomes of that?
So I have also heard that because hospitals have run out of anesthesia, they've run out of morphine, they've run out of antibiotics. I have not seen any data about outcomes, but I don't think it's a situation where people are collecting data. I do know that women have to leave the hospital quickly because of the flooding of injured people, and they often have to walk out of the hospital with their new baby and their fresh cesarean scar. So, you know, I don't have any scientific information, but you can only guess that the outcomes are not good, and that you know, you have pregnancies that have not been monitored, people who have, if you just try to imagine a woman who needs a cesarean, who's laboring at home, who has no access to transportation, who can't call anyone because there's no phone and there's no internet, and the ambulances don't have much fuel. And so how does she get to the hospital? Is it in a donkey cart? Does she walk? You know, you can imagine what that would be like. And then she arrives at a hospital where the sanitation is terrible. It's totally overcrowded. There are thousands of people sheltering. And she gets online with everybody else who's desperately in need of care. And then she has a C-section without adequate anesthesia, maybe done under local, maybe done under nothing, I don't know. And then, you know, it's the ORs are not cleaned because there's no water, there's no disinfectant. I mean, this cannot be good. I'm sure that the infection rates are higher. And then you think about postpartum depression. I mean, you can use your imagination and imagine what the outcomes are. And, you know, there are 5,500 deliveries a month. And so that's a lot of women who are having major difficulties.
And then from like a mental health standpoint, and what does that do to the babies? So we know for a fact that mothers who have postpartum depression, who have severe mental health conditions, that affects their role as mothers for these little babies who are just newborn. And that has very important ramifications for later in life. We know for a fact that women who have postpartum depression who's not been treated well, who are unable to attend emotionally to their babies, that can result after adulthood for these babies, when they grow up and become 18 years of age or older, also an increased mental health conditions such as depression and borderline personality disorder and other chronic mental health conditions. We're manufacturing, it's a human manufactured, catastrophic situation for the mothers, for the babies, for the whole generation that we're seeing live on camera on Instagram.
The other issue we haven't mentioned is the impact of nutrition, because there is a tremendous lack of food. People are actually talking about starvation, talking about waiting for 4 to 8 hours on a bread line to a bakery to get a slice of pita bread. And so malnourished women who are pregnant are also going to deliver babies that are at higher risk, are also going to be more anemic. I mean, nutrition and stress also contribute to obstetrical outcome. And I think, everything that we've said points to the fact that there's no military solution to this medical crisis. It has to be a political solution. And the political solution, besides a ceasefire and massive humanitarian aid, has to be the end of the blockade and the creation of the possibility of a life where people are fed and can live their lives to the fullest. And, the chatter that we see is the Israeli military may be planning to send Gazans to the Sinai and set up, refugee camps there. I mean, just horrific things. And even this chatter about who's going to rule Gaza, it's all a very colonial settler mentality. It's not what do Gazans need and how can we support them to repair the damage that has been done. And I find we as healthcare providers really need to work on the framing and on envisioning a future that is outside the framing of what the people who are currently framing it are doing, because they're not thinking beyond the box, and we need to be thinking beyond the boxes that have been built.
Yeah. I think our time is up. There are a few questions we didn't get to, but we can try to respond to them offline. And thank you so very much, Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Rothchild. It's been great. And there have been several questions in the chat about the presentation. And yes, indeed, it was recorded and it will be posted on our website, which is jvphealth. I put com, I meant jvphealth.org. And that should be there shortly. And also we will put the full press release of the APHA resolution on there. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been terrific.
Thank you so much.